So in response to the question at hand, yeah, I had forgot entirely about that, doing the recording, which I will do for the next, that review issue recording. I'll get that taken care of. Uh, these are long. Mondays are long, so I probably will have more time tomorrow morning. I would estimate to re-record that. And thankfully, the dog, after a day at Camp Out, is very tired, so he's not going to bark incessantly, which he does like to do. Number two on the hit parade, we're going. This is really the crux about the most important categories of antibiotics. A lot of it starts coming today and on Wednesday. So that's really the important part. And to that end, here in the content areas, I'm going between these two PowerPoints. The antimicrobials, the Cowan one, which is the one I had been using previously. I sent you some recorded stuff over the last few days since we weren't here, since Wednesday. And then here, the Nestor antimicrobial, which has a little bit better illustrations, and frankly, the Cowan book does not cover sufficiently really what I think is the most important category, which is cephalosporins. So we will begin there and go from that. So let me get over to here where this is. So we'll start with this. This is kind of what we're looking at. I'm going to jump a little bit between them. This is when they're talking about cell wall antibiotics. The Cowan really goes immediately in to the penicillins, and this is the big player. It's called the beta-lactam ring. And a much better illustration is with Nestor, and you can see numerically it's about the 15th slide. They cover it a little bit different. I'm going to flip back and forth, so I apologize if that's a little confusing. It's because of the therapeutic index. It's extraordinarily, we're targeting peptidoglycan. We don't got none, to coin a phrase. That's only in bacteria. So you have something that's going to offer a lot of really desirable selective toxicity with some limitations. Again, penicillins and cephalosporins, very, very similar categories. They both come from mold, though they're not from the same genera or genus of mold. But they act very, very similarly by basically interfering with the development and the structuring of the peptidoglycan in the cell wall. Because of that, they're inherently better on gram positives than gram negatives, because the gram negative peptidoglycan is surrounded by two membranes. More on that in an instant. So, and the biggest problem with both of these categories is allergies. Okay, they're from mold, and mold produces a lot of allergies. Their side effects, depending on how you've tinkered with them, are not necessarily as powerful. This is that ring. You don't have to memorize the structure. This is what basically is able to interfere with those NAMs and NAGs and all that stuff being able to assemble itself in peptidoglycan. Okay, so they inhibit competitively, which means basically they're fighting away the site where the peptidoglycan is, and so the strands can't bridge together. They even named, and it always was confusing to students. Could call them penicillin binding proteins, and yes, they're very effective against growing cells. I think that's really the big take-home point when we start to look at that. They'll show you in different areas where these beta-lactam drugs and the other big members of this category, as well as the beta-lactam drugs, is vancomycin. Vancomycin's a little bit different. For the longest time, it was a drug of last resort, meaning that with penicillins and cephalosporins and other agents, even older agents, did not work, we could use vanco. Big problem with vanco, okay, and it's still used a lot today, is that it's not active at all orally. It's destroyed easily when you ingest it orally by stomach acid. It's tremendously powerful, and it does a lot of damage inside. So we call it a drug of last resort. And it might interest you. I always tell this particular anecdote. That was our go-to drug for MRSA. You know, when MRSA first started to rear its ugly heads, and it started rearing it in the 70s, more so in the 80s and even into the 90s, people would slam dunk and go to that. So I was doing an operation effectively where PPG Paints Arena is, which used to be the old St. Francis Central Hospital. Walked in there in the doctor's dressing room, and there's a big sign thing. You must read and sign off on this. It was from the pharmacy. We will no longer fill your vancomycin prescriptions unless you document. This is telling the doctors what they can and can't prescribe. So there's a lot of safeguards. Unless you can document, show that you have used at least one, if not two, other alternatives to vanco, because we started to see resistance to vancomycin. And if that became fixed, then we were dealing with Staphylococcus aureus that was becoming a superbug, where we didn't have any means to fight. That would increase the likelihood of fatalities from it. So vanco is used with some degree of caution. We see it used more in long-term care, like nursing homes. Okay, those, you're dealing with a different population. You're trying to keep the infection under control, but they're constantly monitoring with blood tests what they call vanco peaks and troughs to be able to see if you're in the right range to treat. Just to give you an idea, bacitracin is only used topically. Okay, so as it continues on, we're going to look at these different degrees of activity that are there. Okay, peptidoglycan is exposed, the outer membrane protects it. Okay, and remember, if you got a chance to listen to that recording, effectively, I tried to give you the history, so to speak, of why we have MRSA. Okay, and just to reiterate it a little bit, I think you might remember I sent a document to you. You guys got that? You don't have to look at stuff. I did. Effectively, penicillin, all Staph aureus, 95% were sensitive. The more that you use something, it's a chemical weapon. And so Staph aureus and other bacteria began to develop two weapons. One that Staph aureus uses called penicillinase. The other one was called beta-lactamase. That's some forms of Staphylococcus, but mostly other bacteria. Those effectively targeted, as you might guess, the beta-lactam ring. Interestingly, penicillinase was the stronger agent. So as you'll see shortly, we began to tinker in the laboratory. That's what we call them semi-synthetics. They're made to some extent in the laboratory. So naturally occurring penicillins were tinkered with, and we came up with different ways. We started to do additives to make them so they could target gram negatives and get in there underneath the outer membrane. They targeted them so they would target penicillinases and beta-lactamases. So we had a whole different genre, a whole different species. We actually evolved it from chemical warfare. So we began to use penicillinase producing agents. And that's where and typically what you see, one of the better markers, so that where you see names like methicillin and oxacillin. Typically with penicillins, they are not all equal in the sense that some you have to inject and some you take over. So you may wonder, when you're on a nursing floor, why somebody you're giving penicillin pills and some you have to put in an IV. Okay, a good portion of them are deactivated by stomach acids. They tinker with it. And so in the original penicillin, you have penicillin G, which you used to inject, and penicillin V, which is still used today, NPK. Dentists use it because it's still pretty effective when they're doing dental extraction. You're fighting with streptococcus. So what happened afterwards, they developed methicillin and oxacillin. Methicillin by injection. Oxacillin was reactive. We did it again. Then all of a sudden, the next evolution was MRSA. Methicillin and MRSA means methicillin. We defined it in terms of methicillin because it was the most popular. Resistant Staphylococcus aureus. You also have, as you will see very soon, as your careers evolve into the hospital, MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus epidermidis. So it's not limited. So sick people in hospitals, their own bacteria on the surface, on all of your skin all the time, is Staphylococcus epidermidis. Creates big, big problems. And they're equally hard to find antibiotics. That's the net. And so we had to keep tinkering. The good news, such as it was we found an agent that's described as an antibiotic, I don't know what this is, called clavulanic acid. Clavulanic acid, I don't know where it was derived from, whether it's natural or laboratory, we do first, but I specifically targeted this enzyme that bacteria make called beta-lactamase. It blocked it. Good news. So what we did is we started to mix an orally active form of ampicillin. Ampicillin being, you'll see the way we targeted it, the way we modified it. We made it easier to penetrate the gram-negative outer membrane. Again, good, and then again, ampicillin, better by injection, oral form, we'll heard of amoxicillin. So amoxicillin, and amoxicillin is very, if you're not penicillin allergic, all the reason we use amoxicillin like crazy for ear infection, okay, is because, and the research was done here, is we're not an ear hospital. It targets the most common culprits. We're going to talk about that, respiratory diseases. Right after that's the next unit we do. So the beta-lactamase, a lot of those infections, sore throats, ear infections, and sinus infections, and staphylococcal and streptococcal organisms that produce beta-lactamase. So we took the clavulanic acid and we added it, good old amoxicillin. Must know this. What came out of that, a very famous agent that's orally active, augmentin. Augmentin is something some of you might have taken, or you know people who have taken it. It can become in pill and liquid form. And the beauty of augmentin is the clavulanic acid deactivated the beta-lactamase, and then the amoxicillin could do its thing. So it's a very good, so augmenting meant that they bolstered it. So it was really almost synergistic in its nature. That's the good news. Why didn't we put clavulanic acid in all other types of things? Clavulanic acid is not good on your tongue. Okay, so what happened with, and to this day, when I will tell you, I prescribed a lot of augmentin over the years. The first thing you told somebody was, once you start taking this, have a yogurt, have probiotics, whatever you're going to take, acidophilus products, because you're going to have diarrhea. Your stomach's going to be upset because it really destroys the body. So you have to be wary of all of those things. And when they tried to combine it with a la Z-Pak with erythromycin, it was intolerable. So the weapons are not all equal, but in some ways they're useful. So let me go back and show you a little bit here. So this is about the penicillin drugs. So again, G, injection, V, orally active. And so these we consider basic penicillins. This is, you see this kind of tail end chemically, don't have to know anything about the chemicals. Okay, that's where we tinker. Okay, that allows us to use different additives. You notice how this looks different and this looks different still. So when we start looking at methicillin, okay, now methicillin, okay, we're able to deal with penicillinases. They made an orally active form called oxacillin. Here's the amoxicillin there. We began to tinker over here, okay? And so we could have better absorption against gram negatives. And they even tinkered with it for. And the reason they did this is because, and you'll all hear about this, Pseudomonas is a royal. You're going to check your discs. Did you do Pseudomonas for one of your plates in the lab? You made plates with the antibiotic discs last week. Am I correct? Was Pseudomonas one of the organisms? Okay. Pardon me?
I think one of them was like Staphylococcus.
Yeah, one would be staph. I always use Pseudomonas because you find very few things worked for that. But understand, Pseudomonas is a royal pain in the neck, okay, to treat. And what would happen is they know they like penicillins are good drugs in general, so they even tinkered with it more. And we call them extended spectrums, or very, very broad spectrum. So this is kind of what happened in the laboratory. All of these ones, other than the original, are all we call semi-synthetic penicillins. Different problems. A lot of things are in biofilms. This is a classic problem that we see with implanted materials, particularly hardware. Okay, so for orthopedic implants, and I put in lots of pins and lots of wires and screws and things like that, biofilms form, even though that's made out of stainless steel. And it's very hard to penetrate. So you had to have different choices of antibiotics to see what would penetrate that stuff. And if you ever watch a surgery where they have to take out an implant or take out a screw or a pin, a lot of times you'll see yuck on that. That's the biofilm. Okay. So it doesn't get through it. And that alters, as they say here, the susceptibility profile. So there's lots of different things. This is an agent called daptomycin. That's in one of those ones we don't use a whole lot. That's for, because it's got so many problems associated with it. So there's different things that are involved, just to be that. And I want to go back to the other PowerPoint because, again, it's like they almost glossed over all of these topics. And I think it's really important that we pay attention to that. So we're going to move on from this. So, and this is the distinction beta lactamases, et cetera, et cetera. So here, now we're going to look at these different penicillins that are there. Again, this is the same kind of chart that we looked at before, expanded on. Remember, these are the same publisher. Beta-lactam ring and all the different things. Over the years, again, so methicillin by injection, oxacillin and all of its family, cloxacillin, dicloxacillin, were all developed to be orally active. Ampicillin by injection, amoxicillin, orally active. And then these other ones, again, the same kind of a deal. So that's why I said it before, the saddest words you can hear are allergic to penicillin, because not only does it impact penicillins, it impacts other things as well. More on that in a second. So they even gave you a little bit more from this that are there. A lot of these were inactivated by the beta-lactamases, as was even the extended spectrum ones. So when they added the clavulanic acid, the beta-lactamase inhibitor blocking that enzyme, now you had augmentin. You may wonder why I'm going through this. Ever since I started to teach micro for the last more than 20 years, every time I've spoken with nursing instructors at whatever school I was at, they were always very happy that you guys came in when you went into their classes in pharmacology and in pathophysiology, understanding the mechanisms of antibiotics. So that's why I make a big deal of it. I think it's really important. Now, this is the one more than half the antibiotic prescriptions written in the United States on any year are cephalosporins. What does that mean to you? It's the most important category to know. It's the other cell wall problem. There's good news and bad news, isn't there always? Okay. The problem, well, why don't we just use that? And why, when someone's allergic to penicillin, it's not a penicillin, but it's close. They both come from both. There is 10% cross reactivity. That means if you're allergic to penicillin, you're 1 out of 10 likely to be allergic to cephalosporins. Why is that an issue? Because you could have anaphylactic shock and die. And that 10% risk is a big risk because there's other things that you potentially could treat it. You're not, there's 90% chance you'll get better, 10% chance because you're allergic to penicillin. You potentially could die from this. I'll be this. That's why doctors don't do it. Whenever I had a patient who said they were allergic, and I remember acutely, a patient was diabetic. He had a lot of infections. The first time I had one, I said, because I'm allergic. So I called up his diabetologist and said, can we use cephalosporins? He said, yeah. He's been treated with Keflex, cephalosporin. So I had a weapon. So you can't never assume 10% cross-reactivity. That's the bad. Good news. It's more active against beta-lactamase. So it's better than regular penicillins because it will be less likely to be deactivated by beta-lactamase. Okay? It's broader in spectrum, meaning it's much more likely to be effective against gram-negatives, which penicillins are less. And nowadays, cost is not a big factor. Years ago, it was. Now we have a lot of generic cephalosporins that you can use. So, derived from a different fungus or mold, more resistant to beta-lactamases, okay? Chemical modifications, there's a zillion, there's now 5 generations of these. So the later generations are more effective and resist beta-lactamases, even more so, and they're even getting some advanced generations for MRSA that will work. So it's a really good category. When someone would come in, if we had, that's the go-to. Whether it was someone in my office who came in with an obvious infection, we did a stat gram stain, we looked at it right away. If we saw gram-positive cocci, hey, and they're not allergic to penicillin, or we know they can take cephalosporins, that's the prescription. You give it to them and you go, hey, if I call you in 3 or 4 days when we get the full results and we have to change, we change. And the only maybe the limitation bothersome on your stomach. These are a little older, okay? The one that we see used a lot, when they talk about Enterobacteriaceae, those are the things you're using in the lab for gram-negatives. E. coli, okay? Gut bacteria, Enterobacter, Proteus. All those names familiar to you from the lab? Those are all gut bacteria. Those are the most common. Why do we get gram-negative infections? From fecal contamination. They're in urinary tract. There are a lot of problems associated with it. So catheters. So they used to use a lot of aztreonate on that. Why we don't use them so much is there's more side effects than using penicillins and cephalosporins. Here's the Vanco. Okay. The only time you use vancomycin orally is in preparation for gastrointestinal surgery. If you did not know, they will give patients, and you will have occasion, many of you, to do this, vancomycin orally. It just destroys everything in your gut. You get profuse diarrhea. So effectively, they quote and say sterilizing the gut. So when they have to cut in there and remove a tumor, remove an ulcer, do something clever with your gastrointestinal tract, they do that first. I unfortunately had to have that done twice. So it's not fun. But and this is the problem. When you use something like that, it kills a lot of the gut bacteria. It allows C. diff to flourish. Okay, and this is, we play ping pong with this. There's another bacteria in the gut that we'll look at with certain infection, and we'll look at a bit in this unit, called VRE. It stands for vancomycin resistant enterococcus. Enterococcus fecalis is a streptococcal cousin. So VRE is a real problem. So vanco, I'll just put that in, resistant This is what the acronym stands for. Enterococcus. And we think the reason why we have vancomycin-resistant staphylococcus is a transposon. You might remember that from the genetics, one of those little neat things that can jump around, latched on to vancomycin-resistant from enterococcus and transferred it to staphylococcus. There's a lot of excellent evidence to produce that. And what happens when you use the vancomycin to try to treat this, when they tried to treat enterococcal, real, almost like a colitis bacterial infection, the patient got C. diff. When you treated the C. diff, they got VRE. So they ping-ponged it. Very common in nursing homes and long-term. I have a lot of experience. I used to have 300 nursing home patients. My first wife ran a nursing home. Was the weekend and evening supervisor. Basically, on weekends and evenings, she ran the nursing home from a nursing perspective. And my wife now spent 10 years in doing nursing home up at what's called Cranberry Place, which is a nursing home right near Passavant, Cranberry. Oh, so we have. I mean, it's very rewarding. It's not easy necessarily. You gotta like working with older folks. And I liked it when I was a younger folk. No comment about now you're working with people like yourself. You were going to say that. I know it. You're a troublemaker.
All right.
I heard her. You were thinking it. Despite your sweep, you were thinking it. I was actually on camp. I was going to come to the game on Friday. I couldn't park. There were a zillion people at that softball game, the doubleheader. You couldn't find. It was ridiculous. So, all of that's important. Okay. And as you can see, it's totally, everybody, totally ineffective of gram negatives. It can't get through the membrane. So this is really the important, because why am I going crazy about this? It's the most common things that people, all the medicines that we give to people all the time, blood pressure medicine, arthritis medicines, heart medicines, okay, GI medicines, antibiotics. You've got to know a whole slew about those because you see them all the time. That's the important. The next big category is this, protein synthesis. Good news and bad news. They target the 70S ribosome. Well, that's great. That's what bacteria have. The bad news, that's in our mitochondria. Go back to A&P. Go back first week of A&P 1. Okay, when you looked at the parts of the cell, not the first week, the first portion, first quarter of A&P 1, you talked about mitochondria. Mitochondria, remember, have their own DNA, bacterial DNA, single circle of DNA, and they have their own ribosomes to make more mitochondria. Those are 70S ribosomes. So medicines that target this are notorious, not for allergies, but for side effects. That's what limits their ability. So unfortunately, since we have them, okay, that's where the problems occur. And it doesn't matter to me where they attack it. There's a ton of categories. They are used all the time. The most famous of them all, surely, these days is in this category called macrolides. The original member of that category was called erythromycin, and now we've modified it and it's become the Z-Pack, known as azithromycin. A, Z is all letters connected, as you will see. So they are a great category with limitations. Penicillin was really the first antibiotic that was discovered. Okay, remember the accidental discovery that I made a big deal about? Not that it's a big deal. A very famous doctor named Selman Waxman was able to isolate the next antibiotic, and they were in this category called aminoglycosides. Again, you should know my questions are about categories, so you need to know category names. Just like you did those names with all the aldehydes and biguanides and that stuff I know you're annoying us. Part of it is trying to help you enhance your, you got to remember a lot of stuff. You've got to be able to assimilate. That's the difference between this and high school. Just, okay. Oh, we had a chapter test. We had a pre-test. Oh, you don't have that luxury anymore. You've got to be able to recall whatever field you're going into, a lot of information relatively easily. Not expecting you to memorize a chapter and verse, but the stuff you use all the time. So Selman-Waxman, that soil bacteria called Streptomyces griseus is the name. Not that that's a big deal. He named it streptomycin, and that's why they erroneously talk about it. And a lot of antibiotics have the last name mycin, as well as silver. Okay? So it doesn't matter how it works. Okay? It is somewhat limited, but because penicillins work great on gram positives, this generally works really well on gram negatives. Okay? Generally ineffective against anaerobes, which anaerobes are hard to treat, enterococcus, and streptococcus, which is a cousin. So a lot of times we use them with beta-lactams. In the day before there was a lot of availability of cephalosporins, we used to use penicillin and streptomycin together. That was a go-to for mixed infections, okay? So it played a good role with sort of working synergistically. The big problem is toxicity. We utilize these on a long-term basis, read that, is if we have to give it to somebody over a 2-week period or so, 10 to 14 days, you have to monitor kidney function and hearing. They notoriously have renal toxicity, and they have what's called ototoxicity, hearing. Hearing's hard to assess. So if a patient, and particularly an elderly patient, they may be hard of hearing anyway. So if somebody starts to develop ringing or buzzing in their ears, that's a question you need to ask them. Renal's easier because we do that, and typically you blood test every other day. Anybody know what the 2 blood tests are that we use for this kidney function? Didn't have a kidney. Be happy I'm here. Creatinine. And something called BUN, which stands for blood urea nitrogen. Both of these are nitrogenous wastes. And your kidney's primary job, there's a lot of them, is to get rid of nitrogenous waste removal. That's it gets rid of waste products that have nitrogen. We don't have a lot of tolerance for nitrogen. So BUN and creatinine are what you monitor. When those start to go up in your bloodstream, your kidneys are going down. So notice, for instance, they're using one, it's the toxicity. So one that we use the most by injection is for Pseudomonas, not the tobramycin by inhalation, that's for cystic fibrosis. They use something called gentamicin, Gentamycin. So that, that's pretty much the go-to choice. That's by injection. It doesn't work terribly well oral. And so typically every other day in a hospital. Nowadays, a lot of people, people can give themselves injections at home more easily. This is an intramuscular injection, which is not as easy as, say, using a EpiPen, which is very easy to do. Intramuscular is a technique. If you inject directly into a blood vessel, you can cause a lot of problems. So when you go into a muscle, they'll teach you all about this. You have to basically use a longer needle, and you have to pull back on the plunger called aspirating to make sure there's no blood. It's not like the end of the world. Just move the needle a little bit and aspirate again. You don't want to inject things directly into a blood vessel. Those are little techniques you get from injection. I did used to do this stuff. You're all looking at me. Honest to goodness, I did this. Those are your aminoglycosides. We're not done yet. It's like a history lesson. So you have penicillins. Cephalosporins came a little bit after that. considerably later. Cephalosporins probably more in the 70s when we really started to see their usages. The aminoglycosides were second, and every time one of these came out, they were the new wonder drug. So we used them on everything. And, it's the old best thing since sliced bread. To me, that's important. It's bread. Who doesn't like sliced bread? Tetracyclines. Now, forgot to tell you. Okay, cephalosporins, penicillin, cephalosporins, vancomycin are bactericidal. That's why we love them. Aminoglycosides, bactericidal. Even though they have all the side effects, that's why they still have a role. We even to this day use streptomycin in combination for certain kinds of tuberculosis. If you did not know it, everybody, there's a big article that came out from the CDC. They come out with a weekly report, and they're studying the progression of increased cases of tuberculosis in this country. It's only going in that direction. That's not good. The third antibiotic, and now we're getting into bacteriostatics. So that's why the sad words of allergic to penicillin are there, because most of the alternatives to penicillin are bacteriostatic. This, when it originally was discovered, it was called terramycin. They gave it, it's a cure for the common cold. Everybody got it. It's not a bad agent. It's just not a great agent. It's broader in spectrum. It works on gram-positive and gram-negatives, but not great across the board. It works on some exotic bacteria. It's really useful for, things like plague, things like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, things like Lyme disease. You can take it in mini doses. It's been used for what we use most is called vibromycin. It's a very useful drug against a lot of unusual infections, would be the way I would describe it. There's something called minicin or minocycline that people take for acne. For acne, we use these kinds of agents in low doses, what we call subclinical doses. So you can take it every day, and it's really been beneficial for, and acne is a real suffering problem. That's there. I mean, it's the cosmetics of it, the limited resources, so they'll use erythromycins, which we'll get to, in mini doses, because they have less side effects when you have to take them in subclinical or lower doses that are there. Because you're using Accutane as problems. You're familiar with Accutane, everybody? Yeah, that's nasty. There's a lot of depression, a lot of problems. Just getting off the topic a little bit. My stepdaughter was on that really bad acne, and it makes it worse because it kind of pushes everything out to start, the nature of what happened. And eventually it worked fairly well. Before they would release the prescription, she had to get a blood test that day to prove she wasn't pregnant. Then the pharmacy would release it. So we get the blood test done at the hospital and go over to Walmart and get the prescription. And there was suicidal ideation. Ugh. So a lot of agents, I just mentioned that because I think it's important just to remember. It's one of those oddball questions that's likely to rear its ugly head on an NCLEX or something like that. Accutane, a lot of side effects, really toxic during pregnancy. The fetus is not likely to survive. And terrible that is. And the suicidal ideations that are there, because there's a lot of documented cases. It's effective, but not great against both. We're thinking this is going to be better, but there's really a lot of limitations. There's the big pitfall with this is you cannot give it to pre-adolescent children. It causes hard surfaces, read that as calcium surfaces, to be damaged and discolored. Permanent damage to teeth. So your primary teeth may look okay, but when the secondary teeth come in at or around adolescence or slightly before, they're significantly damaged. Okay, and we're not talking about something that you could use whitening strips or things like that. We're talking about big time, dental, cosmetic dental surgery, and that's very expensive. Big bucks. If you have dental insurance, understand it doesn't cover a lot. Still paying off the dentist. My wife had to have like an implant with or a crown. Oh my God. $2,000 covered about 400. Should have been a dentist. The drug of choice. Okay, almost in order. The next one to discover were macrolides. Again, from that same streptomyces, most of these last ones are. Not that you have to know that. Okay, when they say drug of choice, it is very specific. So the Z-Pak, which is the current form that is used of something called erythromycin, and they are in the same family. Like I said, erythromycin, now it's azithromycin as it was modified. Drug of choice is specific because you have to have a very good reason to not use the drug of choice. In addictive disease, drug of choice has a different meaning. It's what the addicted person, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or whatever, that's their DOC or drug of choice. In medicine and in nursing, the drug of choice is what you are supposed to use unless you have a very good reason not to. Well, they're allergic to penicillin and erythromycin. Okay, don't use it. The big problem with it, just like tetracycline, is bacteriostatic. Okay, it does pretty well. Okay, against gram positives, even a limited number of gram negatives, just like penicillin. And it's really one of the best drugs that we can use for something that college students get called primary atypical pneumonia or mycoplasmal pneumonia or walking pneumonia, all the same thing. We get to that in respiratory diseases. Does not do anything for gut bacteria. It caused tremendous amounts of diarrhea. You used to have to take one pill 4 times a day for 10 days. Very hard compliance. By changing the formulation and the half-life of it, the Z-Pak not only made it easier to comply with once daily dosage for only 5 days, okay, better yet, it eliminated most of the problems, digestively speaking, or GI speaking. An older antibiotic that you will not use, I'm probably not going to ask you about, it's called chloramphenicol. Historically, it was used a lot. It was a really good agent, but now I don't even think it's a last resort anymore. I've seen some preparation where they use it topically. Orally, it destroyed the bone marrow. Aplastic anemia means that your bone marrow ain't working and you're going to die of an infection. This really reared its ugly head started in the 60s, and in the 70s we got to the point where it was originally called chloramycetin, where we didn't use it. So it's historically interesting, but I can't think of anybody who uses it today. These are newer categories. These last two, these are the lincosimodes. Still important. There's one member of that family called clindamycin. It's used for 2 reasons. And I used it a lot. Anaerobic, and not a lot of drugs, not a lot of antibiotics will get rid of anaerobic infections. Anaerobic infections are hard to treat. We see a lot of them in diabetics. I have a lot of experience with them. Okay. The other thing why it was useful, it started right out of English, penetrates that slime layer, that biofilm. And so with orthopedic implants like pins and screws and wires, if the suspicion was there was an infection there, that's why I used it a lot. Okay? So the most common anaerobic infection, not named C. diff, is called Bacteroides. Bacteroides is in a lot of areas. It's in our mouth. It's in a lot of our other openings that are there. We'll talk about bite wounds. Bacteroides is a common problem. There's always an anaerobic component. It would work there. The big problem with it, terrible diarrhea. Terrible. Okay, it's called pseudomembranous colitis, and really it's probably brought about by C. diff. If you know somebody who had C. diff, it ain't good. I also had that back in 2005. Remember I told you my first wife worked in a nursing home? She probably, and when you work in one of those places, it's not always feasible, but whatever you have on you, particularly if you're working with patients who have C. diff, you probably should try to remove before you go into the house. It probably was on her, some way, shape, or form, and somehow it got contaminated our counter in the kitchen. Next thing I know, and I wasn't very healthy then, smoking like a chimney and taking all sorts of medicines. I was in big trouble. Didn't have to go to the hospital for that. So that's there as well. We're almost done. As a matter of fact, I will save these two. These two categories are important because this is where we've morphed into these newer categories specifically to target MRSA. So we'll leave it with that. I'll stop her there. Thank you very much.